If you ask most psychologists what the most important year of our lives are, they will say the early years of our life, our childhood. The person you are today is mostly down to what you saw and experienced in your childhood. This is the reason why children are considered a protected class in society, because the people and things they experience will undoubtedly shape who they grow up to be. Any crimes committed against children are the ones that we as a society look down upon the most, because when someone commits an act against a child, they are not only physically hurting the child, but mentally they are hurting the child, which can cause more damage than physically hurting the child. Mentally abusing a child can cause wounds that never heal, because in many cases the perpetrator took something that the child can never get back, which is what happened with Jaycee Lee Dugard. Jaycee had her childhood taken away from her. Jaycee Lee Dugard was born on May 3rd, 1980. She lived a normal life with her mother Terry and stepfather Carl and half-sister named Shayna. On June 10th, 1991, when she was 11, she would be walking to the bus stop in order to go to school, when out of the dark a van pulled up, and the man driving the van asked for directions, but as soon as she started talking, he stunned her using a stun gun. Jaycee later recalls that her entire body froze and she couldn't move. Another person in the van would pick up Jaycee and put a blanket over her head. Jaycee would drift in and out of consciousness until she arrived at the perpetrator's house. Some of Jaycee's classmates also witnessed her being kidnapped as they were waiting at the bus stop. Carl would later recall that he saw the kidnapping taking place and panicked, so he chased after the perpetrators on his bike. However, it ended up being futile as he couldn't catch up to the van. After calling the cops, the town of South Lake Tahoe put together a search and rescue operation, where millions of people helped search for Jaycee. Local news stations, newspapers, and media outlets put together information about Jaycee so the public could keep an eye out for her. After driving for a while, Jaycee would regain consciousness. She was in a room with a man and another perpetrator, and two cats. The perpetrator made Jaycee undress and get in the shower with him. Both of them undressed and got in the shower. Jaycee would suffer sexual abuse at the hands of the perpetrator after he would lead her to the shed and his backyard, where he would handcuff Jaycee to the shed. Jaycee would spend the next 18 years trapped inside this shed and the backyard. During the first few years, the only human contact she had was when the perpetrator brought her food and water, along with the bucket she used to go to the bathroom. Jaycee would constantly be raped and used as an object. Most nights, Jaycee would cry herself to sleep or just scream until she passed out from exhaustion. The perpetrator told Jaycee that the more she argued, fought against him, or tried to resist, the worse and more violent he would become. This is where the majority of the trauma and damage that was done to Jaycee occurred. Not when he physically assaulted her, but the mental damage he inflicted upon her. I am not trying to negate or diminish the sexual or physical trauma she experienced, because she experienced abuse that no one should experience. The perpetrator was Jaycee's only source of human interaction, the only way she got food and water. In many ways, Jaycee depended on him for her survival. She unconditionally became attached to the perpetrator. She learned not to fight back or yell or scream for help. She learned to become his toy and do whatever he said, as there was no point in escaping. The perpetrator had physical control over Jaycee, but more importantly, he had mental control over her as well. An example of this was that years later, the perpetrator started a printing business, and Jaycee was the graphic designer of the business. She regularly made phone calls and plans with customers. Years later, when Jaycee was rescued and the perpetrator was behind bars, customers of the business recalled that she never once tried to tell them that she was being kidnapped, who she was, or that she was in danger. She had access to a computer, a phone, and regularly talked with customers, but she never once tried to escape. This proves how effective the perpetrator's mental indoctrination was and how much damage it had done to Jaycee's mental state. Jaycee was sexually abused and raped by the perpetrator so many times that she was pregnant twice. She gave birth to when she was 13 and when she was 17. When Jaycee was rescued at the age of 29, her daughters were 12 years old and 16-year-olds respectively. The daughters of Jaycee grew up knowing nothing of the outside world. They only knew the world that the perpetrator had provided to them, which was the shed and the tents in his backyard. Throughout the years, the perpetrator had given Jaycee more freedom. He no longer handcuffed her, and he let her leave the shed. He put up tents in his backyard when her kids were born, but most importantly of all, he gave Jaycee a TV. The TV that the perpetrator gave Jaycee was undoubtedly the pillar that helped Jaycee keep going and looking at each day with optimism. To Jaycee, the TV symbolized the outside world, people who were free, and she got to see places and people she would never experience. Jaycee raised her kids by herself with the help of the TV. She homeschooled them both using programs such as Elmo and Sesame Street. The TV even helped Jaycee give birth to both of the girls, as she learned about pregnancy and sex by watching TV. Until now, I have not named the people who did this to Jaycee. I have simply called them the perpetrators. I debated on whether or not I should include them for the damage they did to Jaycee, but I decided that it was important enough to name them. Philip Garrido was born on April 5, 1951. When Philip was 16 years old, he was involved in a terrible motorcycle accident, which badly injured his head. After the accident, he became involved in drugs. He smoked marijuana and also experimented with LSD. After experimenting with LSD, he started telling friends and family that he could talk and communicate with God. He also spoke about a secret black box of thoughts he had. After this, his life was plagued by his inability to control his sexual desires, and he also lacked the ability to rationalize his own fantasies with reality. Philip Garrido had a history of sexual deviance. He would masturbate in public in places like bars, restaurants, and amusement parks. He was also caught masturbating in front of elementary school and high school while looking at girls. Sometimes he would expose himself to the unsuspecting girls. Before kidnapping Jaycee, he had previously raped a 14-year-old girl, but the charges were dropped as the girl refused to testify. Along with being a pedophile and convicted sex offender, Philip was also a drug addict. In 1995, he was arrested after kidnapping and raping 25-year-old Catherine Calloway inside a warehouse. Philip received a 15-year prison sentence for this. However, he was released on parole after only serving 11 years behind bars. Before Philip went to prison, he was married, but he divorced his wife while he was in prison. When Philip was on parole, he had to wear an ankle monitor and had to have mandatory meetings with his parole officers, all of which never happened. The reason why Philip, in his sick and sexually deviant mind, kidnapped Jaycee was because he needed someone to stop him from hurting anyone else. Jaycee recalls part of her sexual torture at the hands of Philip as runs. These were days where Philip would be under the effects of meth and force Jaycee to do all sorts of disgusting sexual stuff with him for days without sleep. Afterwards, Philip would break down and tell Jaycee the devil had infected him with a sickness and she was specifically chosen by God in order to save the children from Philip. These runs would end with Philip sobbing on the ground, apologizing to Jaycee. In a lot of ways, this was the ultimate power play from Philip, because Jaycee would confront him even after experiencing abuse from him. To Philip, this just proved that Jaycee was sent to him from God, because she cared about him even after he abused her, when the reality was Jaycee was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. When Philip got divorced, he very quickly found someone else. He met his future wife in prison, Nancy Bocanegra, as she was visiting her uncle. Nancy and Philip were married while Philip was still in prison. Nancy was very much involved and an accomplice in the kidnapping. Nancy helped Philip kidnap Jaycee in the first place, as she placed a towel over her head so she couldn't see where they were going when Philip first kidnapped Jaycee. However, Philip didn't introduce Jaycee to Nancy until she was kidnapped for 7 months. Jaycee recalls that Nancy was just as manipulative as Philip. Nancy would sometimes feel pity and feel horrible for what she did to Jaycee. She would show humanity to Jaycee. Nancy would sometimes bring her toys, stuffed animals, and extra food. Other times she would be cruel and express thoughts of jealousy towards Jaycee. Nancy grew jealous with Jaycee because she was the only one who received all of her husband's attention. Even though Nancy sometimes felt bad for Jaycee, she never once tried to help her escape or let her leave when Philip wasn't there. Philip started experimenting with drugs once again after Jaycee had matured into a woman. After all, she had been held captive at this time for 16 years. Jaycee was 27 and no longer fulfilled Philip's sexual urges, so he turned to drugs in order to get a rush. He wanted to cure his own schizophrenia, which he believed he had accomplished. On August 24th of 2009, he delivered a manifesto to the FBI headquarters in San Francisco. It was a 4-page essay that detailed how to cure sexual deviance behaviors through religion and his ideas of sexuality. Throughout her time in captivity, there were many instances where Jaycee could have been saved or helped, but she wasn't. The main person is Nancy Garrido. While she never directly helped Jaycee escape or let her leave, she argued in a court of law that she was more of a bystander than a participant in the torture Jaycee experienced at the hands of Philip. She was also a victim of Philip, as she was scared of what would happen to her if Jaycee went free. She was scared that everything that was happening to Jaycee would happen to her. Even if that was the case, on one occasion, Philip was arrested for 1 month for violating his parole. In the entire month, Nancy never helped Jaycee or even attempted to escape herself. From 1999 to 2007, Philip was supposed to have regular mental health assessments, but he didn't. A neighbor called 911 to report little girls in Philip's backyard because the neighbor knew Philip was a sex offender. The officer on the scene never checked the backyard. In 2008, Philip had an ankle monitor placed on him. It showed that he consistently traveled over the 25-mile limit he had placed on him, and he also consistently left his home after curfew. One day, Philip would head to the University of California, Berkeley. He wanted to hold an event at the university that promoted his church that he had stated, called God's Desire. He wanted to hold the seminar there in order to get people to join his church. He then spoke with the event manager of the school, Lisa Campbell. When Philip started to speak to Lisa, she noticed that he was very weird. He had an erratic behavior, and when Philip came to the university, he also brought along his 2 daughters, the children of Jaycee. Lisa noticed that the 2 little girls that he had brought along with him were very pale, almost too pale, as if the girls had never been in the sun, and acted utterly submissive towards Philip. They never talked and stood completely still. Lisa told Philip to make an appointment for the next day, which he did. Lisa told Philip to write down his name. In the process, Lisa then contacted campus police officer Allie Jacobs, who ran a background check on Philip to discover he was a registered sex offender. Philip was on parole, so Officer Allie Jacobs contacted Philip's parole officer. The parole officer went to Philip's home, where they questioned him and told him he needed to report back to them tomorrow at the police station. Philip would report back to the police station and tell them that Jaycee and her daughters were all daughters of his own brother, while Jaycee told them that she was a battered woman from Minnesota named Alyssa that was living with Philip and her 2 daughters. Police officers would separate Philip from the women and girls. When the police officer began to question Jaycee, she became increasingly more defensive and protective of Philip by saying he was a good man and he was extremely good to her and her kids. Officers noticed that she got more and more agitated the more people questioned her about what she was doing with Philip and who she was. Officers then told her that she needed to tell them the truth because nobody's story was adding up. Philip then told the officers he was the father of the girls and that Jaycee was a mother. He then confessed to the crimes he had committed, telling them, "A long time ago I kidnapped that girl." When a female officer heard this, she would go to Jaycee and tell her that Philip had confessed. Jaycee had been under Philip's control physically and mentally for so long that she couldn't say her name. She could only write it down. She wrote down her name, Jaycee Lee Dugard. After 18 years, the torture was over. Officers from that day remember that Jaycee could not stop crying both tears of sadness and tears of happiness as she was finally free. When the police department attempted to connect Jaycee to her mother, they asked her if she had any questions. She just wanted to know if her mother and Carl, her stepfather, were still together. They weren't. Jaycee's disappearance had taken a toll on their relationship and they had to split up years ago. Jaycee's mother, Terry, could not believe her daughter was found after all these years. When they were reunited, Terry said that when Jaycee was younger, they would go into the backyard and look at the moon together. Years later, Terry would still look up at the moon and ask, "Okay, where are you now, Jaycee?" Jaycee has since transitioned into regular life as much as she can, little by little. She is currently involved in a lot of advocacy work, dealing with people who have dealt with abductions and other traumas. Jaycee hopes to be remembered by what she is doing and what she does, not by what happened to her. Both Philip and Nancy were found guilty and convicted for kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. Philip was sentenced to 431 years in prison and Nancy was sentenced to 36 years in prison. Jaycee gave a closing testimony in front of the grand jury that was read out loud by Terry, her mother, in which she said, "To you, Philip, I say I have always been a thing for your amusement. I hated every second of every day for 18 years because of you and the sexual perversion you forced on me. And to you, Nancy, I have nothing to say. Both of you can save your apologies and empty words. For all the crimes you have committed, I hope you have as many sleepless nights as I did." And as always, thank you for watching.